Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Spring Tribal Climate Webinar. My name is Stefan Panjin. I'm the Tribal Resilience Liaison for the North Central region. I'm working directly for the Great Plains Tribal Water Alliance. I work in coordination with the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, and I'm hosting this webinar from the traditional lands of the Ute, Arapaho, Cheyenne peoples, and numerous other indigenous peoples just outside of Denver, Colorado. The Great Plains Tribal Water Alliance is a nonprofit organization. They serve as an advisory committee to the Great Plains Tribal Chairmen's Association on all matters with regard to technical and policy issues regarding the water resources of member tribal nations. And the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center is a partnership between the U.S. Geologic Survey, the University of Colorado at Boulder, and 5 consortium partners. The NC-CASC fosters innovative applied research in support of tribal, federal, state, and local natural resource management and decision-making. And we cover the states of Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Kansas, and Nebraska. I'll post some links to both those organizations in the chat later, so you can go in there and learn more about those organizations. The goal of this webinar is to provide information, tools, and resources for tribal resource managers, so they can use that in addressing climate change. Sometimes we highlight work done by those tribal resource managers, for example, their climate adaptation planning process. And other times we bring on leaders in the field to discuss other topics like today's webinar. Today's presentation and discussion will cover a number of different topics, one of which being food sovereignty and how that's connected to language, culture, and education. And it should be made clear that education and native language and cultural revitalization are definitely climate adaptation actions. They're critical for building resilience in an increasingly changing and uncertain world. Just consider the upheaval to the global supply chain we've seen during this pandemic, as well as the ways flooding, drought, and extreme weather impact our access to food and goods. In this context, it becomes clear that local solutions and community involvement are critical for climate adaptation. So just a few things before I introduce our speaker. We are recording this webinar. The recording will be available on the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center's YouTube channel. I'll put that link in the chat as well. If you have questions during the presentation, feel free to put them in the chat. I can read them out after, and we'll prioritize those questions. Once the presentation is over, you're welcome to take yourself off mute and ask a question or comment. We definitely really encourage audience interaction. So now for our guest speaker, we are lucky and pleased to have Dr. Val Small, so enrolled Crow tribal member. She joined Trees, Water, and People in April of 2019 as their national program director. TWP is located in Fort Collins, Colorado. Dr. Small has been developing their U.S. Tribal Homelands Regeneration program that works to empower tribal culture, ecology, and food systems. TWP currently works with tribes in South Dakota, New Mexico, and Colorado, securing funding to increase technical capacity and foster tribal youth elder connections through community-led natural resource restoration projects. The mission of the program is to provide tribal assistance in building economically resilient communities while reducing the impacts of climate change. The purpose is to help tribes increase access to traditionally harvested species used as food sources and for sacred ceremonies, while also building local economies around regenerating culturally important plant and animal species and monitoring programs to improve food security within the reservation lands. Dr. Small was also a co-author of the 4th National Climate Assessment, the North Great Plains Chapter, and is an affiliate faculty member in the Department of Agriculture Biology at Colorado State University. Please welcome Dr. Small.
Aho, Kajila. Kahe Daichel Bikbim Salka. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining me. I'd like to talk today a little bit about Trees, Water, and People and how we try to convene and help build tribal community resilience, and sort of the role that nonprofits can play in helping tribes to achieve their on-the-ground project strategies developed through their climate adaptation plans. Before we continue, I would like to dedicate this to my kala, Anita Yellowtail Moran. Batata Chachi has good knowledge and just recently passed due to COVID. She was actually a longtime member living here 30 years in Fort Collins, Colorado, one of the original founders of the annual Colorado Intertribal Powwow Association held here in Fort Collins, and did quite a bit of work through the museum with music related events. So I'd like to dedicate that to her. I would like to also begin with our Can everyone see this?
Yes.
I want to make sure you understand the importance of emphasizing the relationship between people and land. That Native people recognize that everything has a spirit: plants, animals, insects, mountains, and water. Native American identity is deeply tied to these, and they are referenced and respected in our culture, our creation stories, healing ceremonies, and celebrations. Please keep this in mind as I share the land acknowledgement with you. So we acknowledge and respect that the land we are on today is the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations and peoples. This was also a site of trade, gathering, and healing for numerous other Native tribes. We recognize the indigenous peoples as original stewards of this land and all the relatives within it. As these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, the ties nations have to their traditional homelands are renewed and reaffirmed. Thank you.
Ahora ya es un lajar que lo atravesó, viene desde la punta del volcán y lo atravesó todas las parcelas para abajo. Si pueden dar cuenta, esto que vemos aquí es la raíz del café. El café que todavía existe. Esto es la raíz, miren. ¿Cuánto de
Sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to stop this. Anybody?
Maybe go into slide 3 and hit pause on the.
Go back to the slide and pause.
Lived on for centuries, literally.
Or wherever you're playing it from.
What we're seeing a lot today, people not having a choice, not being able to feed their families where they are.
There you go.
Okay, sorry about that.
That's all right. And then if you want to go back into presenter mode and just proceed from there. Perfect.
So sorry about that. Our vision through Trees, Water, and People is to really support community-led regenerative natural resource projects. We do that to improve the economics, social, and cultural lifeways, as we believe that ecosystems within tribal lands are best protected when the local people lead, design, and economically benefit from and participate in the care and their management. So our core tenets really is that what we just mentioned, that natural resources are best protected when the local people play an active role in their care, and that preserving the local ecosystem is really essential for the health and well-being, as all things are sacred and connected. So just to give you an introduction to who we are in Fort Collins, Colorado, and these are our national program team members. Sebastian Africano is our executive director. James Calabasa, Santo Domingo Kiva, is our national program manager, and Emily Swartz just recently joined us as our national program coordinator and has worked with indigenous tribes in Arizona and in British Columbia, and is a GIS and specialist, and also has her certificate in running chainsaws. So we're delighted to have her on board. We also have a great program, a support team for our program. Jose Calabasa, or Jose, I'm sorry, Shalit, is our communications manager. He is also our videographer, and Sammy Louth, our grants manager. Why do we do this work? We really try to look at this from empowering tribal communities to really heal these degraded ecosystems, both traditional and ancestral lands affected by the environmental impacts, natural disasters, particularly as we see climate change impacts continue to disproportionately impact Indian country. We want to promote indigenous land stewardship approaches for regeneration and sustainability of these precious natural resources, and facilitate this transmission of traditional knowledge between youth and elders to conserve and protect our cultural lifeways for generations yet to come. Our tribal community engagement model is really community development based, focusing on long-term health and well-being, is really tied to the natural resources. It's a long-term commitment we make. If you see the picture on the right, this is delivering after we delivered trees 2 years ago to Henry Red Cloud for the OST tribe to plant 13,000 ponderosa pine trees in a former burn scar site, which is how we actually started in the restoration part of our program with Henry Red Cloud. So we have these partnerships with Henry Red Cloud, for instance, who runs his own nonprofit, Red Cloud Renewable, and partnerships that really share the values of community design led and implemented projects to support these local indigenous projects that focus on improving food sovereignty. But we do this through honoring tribal sovereignty as sovereign nations, and respect cultural norms and priorities as to what species gets planted and where and when. So our national program projects thus far really have started to grow since I came on board 2 years ago, and James Calabasa came on shortly before me. And before that, we were only engaged with Henry Red Cloud. And since then, we have expanded our program reach to include another partnership with Rebel Earth Chanwick Monkey on Pine Ridge, and also with the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe and with the Tri Pueblo Coalition in New Mexico. We do reforestation projects, which are really community-based models that address conservation, and we began really in post-burn scar sites. So that's what initially led us in 2015 to start bringing ponderosa pines to the Pine Ridge Reservation, was for the purpose of restoring a degraded ponderosa pine forest that had been subjected to a high intensity fire. So we do this through landscape restoration at landscape scales to try to support tribal communities to restore and these sustainable ecosystems that really are important and linked to the preservation of culture, land, language, as it's all connected. We focus a lot on food security, and we just started 2 years ago delivering food source species such as chokecherry and buffalo berry and wild plums to Pine Ridge for dissemination throughout the community, as well as to try to plant on OST identified lands. We also work through renewable energy through education. I was just telling someone earlier before we began that we have a solar warrior empowerment training program for tribal middle-aged school students, where they use a small 12-volt charge with a solar panel suitcase and learn how to put it together. We partner with the National Indian Youth Leadership Project that really helps to provide a pro-social emotional behavior to build leadership skills, team building skills, and increase self-esteem, to let these youth know that they play an important part in the future of their community. So some of our partners and tribes that we work with: Red Cloud Renewable, the Tri Pueblo Coalition, which consists of the Jemez, Cochiti, and Santo Domingo, Ute Mountain Ute Tribe, the Nature Conservancy in New Mexico, and the Colorado State Forest Nursery Service, which is where a lot of the trees that we plant for tribes that we deliver are grown, and using locally sourced seeds. Our East Jemez Landscapes Futures we're a part of as well, that watershed group, to try to bring the Indigenous voices into that process to make sure that those priorities for their lands are included in at the table as they work through this watershed restoration. The Quivira Coalition is now working on developing and offering rangeland workshops for the Pueblos in New Mexico. We also, as I mentioned, work with the National Indian Youth Leadership Project, who is also going to be bringing in their students for our tree seedling planting restoration projects on Pine Ridge, as well as in New Mexico. And we also work with the Santa Fe Indian School, who actually we gift trees to, and their students then have the opportunity to plant their trees within their reservation or their Pueblo homelands. So one of our new partners a couple of years back is with Chonwick Monkey, Rebel Earth Farms in Martin, South Dakota. This is just a recent picture of Patricia Hammond, who is one of the co-founders of both the Chonwick Monkey and Rebel Earth Farms in Martin. And you can tell that they have right now 4 hoop houses that they're building. And I'll also get into a little bit how we support them, as well as food sovereignty during the time of COVID. I think it's important to cover how we were able to sort of shift what we normally do, which is more community-based, to when the lockdowns happened, how we were able to try to support emergency food, water, and medicine relief within some of our communities. So this was in March and April of last year. We were able to provide funds for COVID-19 emergency food, water, and medicine distribution through Chonwick Monkey Rebel Earth Farms, who were able to buy bulk foods in Rapid City and deliver them to particularly vulnerable populations within the Pine Ridge Reservation, including a youth group home, elders, and those that are disabled, that cannot obviously get access to foods. We also then put on in September a 5-week webinar series to try to bring together a program that would address these severe food insecurity issues that were exacerbated by the COVID-19 lockdowns. I think what really became obvious is that, you know, Indigenous reservations are already food scarce in terms of healthy food options. And there are a lot of tribes now that are working towards building their food sovereignty programs, both in terms of providing healthy food options through greenhouse development, but also trying to develop economies built around food sources that they can then use through pop-up markets, which is something we're working with Chonwick Monkey on. We also wanted to bring experts in, and Dr. Jeremy Pinto from the U.S. Forest Service, who also runs the Intertribal Ag Council, was kind enough, and we were honored to bring him as a co-sponsor for this 5-week, once-a-week seminar webinar series that is recorded and you can still access. We were so honored to open up our webinar series, Chef Sean Sherman, who really is bringing back the fact that you can find healthy food options outside your door and not to develop and not depend on commodity food options, which are not always the healthiest options, and that most of the foods within reservation boundaries come from outside the reservation. And what we have to start thinking about is bringing that economy back to around foods in order to start changing how foods are distributed throughout reservations, how they are grown, and allow that slow, also bringing in the cultural component of introducing our kids, our students to the language and the cultural places that are associated with these healthy food options that are out our door, and also bringing back bison. And so in degraded ecosystems, one of the things we're trying to do at Trees, Water, and People is to restore these degraded ecosystems so that you can bring sort of the rewilding back and regenerate lands so that these medicines and these foods that are traditional foods that are being brought back through people like Sean Sherman, through the chef at Tukabi in Denver, among many other chefs that I cannot remember their names at the moment, are starting to sort of see a resurgence and a decolonization of the diet within reservations. So we entitled this Empowering Tribal Culture, Ecology, and Food Systems to address seed storage, seed collection and techniques, agroforestry, community benefits and challenges of tribal greenhouse, infrastructure management, and then also looking at native seed restoration for rangelands with Christina Eisenberg, who's done a lot of work in Fort Belknap. So our program growth really is based on respecting traditional Indigenous knowledges and promoting culturally driven projects. These are not our projects, they belong to the tribe. What we do is act as conveners to identify long-term relationships we have with our donor base and with foundations we've developed relationships with, who really believe in Trees, Water, and People's vision and mission, and really want to try to support particularly food sovereignty and restoration projects within tribal lands. So we want to expand our support for tribal natural resources in restoring those, building circular economy, community-based economies through foods and through restoration of their own tribal lands, and collaborate with Indigenous leaders and students to do landscape scale projects with, oftentimes with federal and state agencies. Tribes have not always had the best experience. And so what we try to do is try to help and make sure that the tribal's priorities and within those large scale projects, as well as obtaining funding for them through grant writing, is to make sure that their wants and needs are front and center for within the ancestral lands, as well as their own traditional homelands. And that we really are promoting health and well-being of peoples through regeneration and healing of these traditional homelands. So I'd like to say thank you very much, and aho, and I'm open to any questions. I think it's best to leave the better part of our time for just open questions and answers from all of you. And thank you so much. Aho Kashila.
Thanks so much, Val. That was fantastic.
Sorry about that start there. Kind of the YouTube thing got away from me.
Yeah, you just never know with the Zoom and with webinars. So we just had a couple questions come in. One asking if you are willing to share your presentation. So someone wanted
Absolutely,
to know.
yeah. But, you know, I'd be happy to, if you send an email to me or to Stefan, he can send you my email address. And it's just Valerie@treeswaterpeople.org. And I will certainly, you know, send you a copy of the slides.
Great. Yeah, if you have another question, feel free to type it in the chat. You're also welcome to take yourself off mute and do that. And just a heads up, I had to mute a couple folks during the presentation. We were just getting some feedback. So if
Okay.
you're wondering why You found yourself on mute. That is the reason.
Okay.
Looks like there's a question. Are you going to focus on trees like pinyon pine as those are important food?
Yes, absolutely. Again, we do not develop or decide on the tree species that are being planted. What we do is basically try to implement, and through finding the funding and identifying key partners who might be able to help in either capacity building, because that's another component to the program, is to make sure that we have the training in place for either GIS mapping, or as in the case with the Pueblos, doing some rangeland workshops, feral horse management, that kind of thing through Covera. So again, what we try to do is just implement what the tribal priorities are in terms of tree species, and make sure that we have a diverse mix, and that the community is involved in the planting process. That also includes making sure that, for instance, even if women aren't actively involved in the planting process, we make sure that they are reimbursed and brought into it as well in the costs that we cover, so that, in other words, we purchase the tree seedlings, and they're not really, tree seedlings aren't just ready for us to pick up. We have to put that order in sort of the fall before, if we're getting it from the Colorado State Forest Nursery. What we're trying to do really is try to move into getting more local based, indigenous based tree growers. But that's sort of something we're working with in each of the communities. So essentially, they're not our projects, but we try to make a diverse mix, and it's always focused on what is the priority for that the tribe wants. So again, it's not our project, but we certainly recognize that pinyon pine is also another part of the mix.
Great. I had a question here from Phil. Is TWP open to work with tribal organizations? Do we need an MOA or a memorandum of agreement?
Well, okay, I'd like to explain a little bit. It really depends on, where we're at. For instance, what we, do try to do is try to support and lift those indigenous local nonprofits through helping them with funding, grant writing, and support them in their efforts to build their food sovereignty programs. However, we also work directly with tribal natural resource departments, such as the Tri Pueblo Coalition, where we actively engage with their tribal natural resource departments. So it really is dependent upon who we work with, and each tribe is unique, and so we are basically do work with a sort of an MOU process where we let you know what costs we're covering, where we usually purchase the trees, get those in the nursery growing. Those seeds are locally sourced, which is another thing that we're trying to expand on right now in New Mexico, is working in a collective for the Pueblos to come together for a seed collection and storage for disseminating among Pueblos. So, again, we're still continuing to work towards building sovereignty through the development of these greenhouses, these tree growing and vegetables gardening, so that the community can support itself and build local economies around these things. For now, we're getting these grown a year previous. So if you call us up and ask for 500 trees, tomorrow we can't, unless there's some surplus somewhere, we probably can't do that. But it really is dependent, and it's all unique. And yes, we do sort of develop an MOU that just sort of is an agreement about what we cover in terms of costs, the supplies, the tools. And we also try to cover for food that's done for the people who are planting, because 15,000 trees have to be stored in a greenhouse. It takes, a couple of weeks at least, depending on how many volunteers that you have.
Oh, good boy.
Great. Yeah, that's super helpful. Another question for you. I believe you mentioned that one of the beginnings of your program was in post-wildfire environments. Can you talk
Yes,
about the challenges and successes you've had in those environments?
exactly. So right now with the post-burn scar sites on Pine Ridge, we seem to be successful in having a fairly high seedling survival rate, about 95%, 90% survival. And this is because Henry Red Cloud sort of serves as the intermediary with the OST Tribal Natural Resource Department. They determine what lands or where they want to identify where they want to plant those ponderosa pines. And so what we do is try to help them also develop monitoring capacity to be able to monitor their own seedling survival. We also come out and do seedling survivals because rates and do the mapping for those places where those seedlings are planted. And the reason we do that is because we have funders who require us to report back our seedling survival success rate. So I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I think you keep touching on this point of the way that you work with organizations on the ground and how relationship-based that is,
Yes,
and
it's all
how,
relationship based. It's all based on trust. It's very
yeah,
important that, you know, we want to come in and try to, so in the long run, try to help implement, you know, climate adaptation planning is great, but eventually, you know, that's supposed to be an iterative process. It's also very frustrating that tribes don't always have a lot of funding available to implement on the ground projects. And so you may have some EQIP USDA money, you may have some GAP funding through EPA. You have a lot of funding through BIA for planning. However, what I found in developing our program was that what we want to do is try to bring funding in where there's a gap, and that is to implement these on the ground projects, but do it in such a way that it brings communities together, particularly to build food sources, to make sure that we have species to access, to harvest for ceremony, for medicine, for fiber. So all of those are key. It's all connected. And that's, you know, sort of been our approach. For the burn scar sites in New Mexico, we haven't been as successful, but that's anticipated in the uplands to have a lower percentage of survival rates. We work directly with the Forest Service and with, you know, some of the research universities there on trying to make sure that when we do our, before we do the planting, we utilize GIS to identify specific slope and aspect to make sure that they have the best chance to survive, given that climate change is causing so much trouble with the dependency of the timing and the amount that comes in the form of monsoon. So again, those are our experiences in post-burn scar sites. We will also be working in developing workforce development crew for Indigenous and Latinx. So if anyone is interested, please reach out. We're trying to bring together a group to go out this summer, late fall, for our Cameron Peak restoration, providing that would provide a training for Indigenous and Latinx crew to go out and work on actively replanting for our Cameron Peak fire.
great. Yeah. And for those of you who don't know, Cameron Peak is just outside of Fort
Thank you.
Collins. Yeah, and
Yeah.
was the
We had a
site
lot of fire here last
right,
year.
massive
It
burn.
rained ash for a couple of months.
And this is a good follow-up question because you were talking about kind of the preparation you do for planting, but this question is, do the forest or grassland restoration efforts require much maintenance after replanting?
Not necessarily. I think it's more monitoring and making sure that when we do the planting, for instance, we try to do it in such a way that is going to ensure success. So for instance, now in the uplands in New Mexico, we have to make sure that we're sort of building in using slash to make sure that we've got little nurseries that are available to capture soil moisture. We're also doing some soil testing to make sure that where we're planting doesn't need to first have some grass restoration and herb restoration prior to. So we're not trying to replant the whole forest. We're doing these in small 25-meter circular plots and then gauging the success on those. Also identifying the fact that climate change is having an impact on upland species, particularly in their northerly distribution, knowing that at some point it may be necessary to use the more southern subspecies to plant in some of these uplands in New Mexico, as you know, the warming climate may prevent succession and success of those particularly ponderosa pine or Douglas fir trees from future success.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that about the GIS and some other kind of remote sensing tools that could
Yes.
be used because of how massive some of these areas are, like that Cameron
Yes.
Peak fire, for example. Yeah, having those tools available to monitor those sites seems like a requirement. Here's another question. It says land managing agencies like U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, U.S. Forest Service, National Park Service, and Bureau of Land Management sometimes get directives to quickly develop natural resource management plans for the land units. These are ancestral homelands of tribes everywhere. Do you
Yes.
have any suggestions for agencies to not just include tribal input? I'm guessing alluding to like the check the box exercise that was done previous administration, but bring tribes to the forefront in these Western style processes.
Absolutely. And, you know, I don't have it with me, but the Kyle Powis White, Dr. White had prepared a paper on successful collaboration in these multi-actor, you know, projects in the Great Lakes region. And what makes them successful is the fact that they bring Indigenous voices to the table during planning prior to any of the implementation. And so, you know, one of the things that I would suggest is to make sure that that they recognize that before, and what I'd like to also be the message to our federal partners, state partners, and academics is to before you set up any funding opportunities, it oftentimes is found that we're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. You create a funding for a specific project when in fact a lot of natural resource departments for tribes really need funding to provide people in those seats to do those projects. And so that's one area. Another area is to make sure that these partners, these tribal or these federal partners recognize that before the planning begins, to recognize that there are other worldviews and that they may not be similar to yours, but they are just as important. And these knowledges have been ancestral knowledges very effective, as we have found in bringing back Indigenous methods of fire, you know, prescribed burning. And so while, you know, I recognize that federal agency people have limits, but I also think that it's an important message to bring back to them that tribal voices don't need to just be at the table when it's all said and done, but rather even those traditionally ancestral lands, they should have definitely a driving voice on how those are managed.
Great, yeah, that's helpful. And I think you keep coming back to this notion of relationship building. And I think
Yes.
this is something we aim for in these webinars, providing opportunities to hear different perspectives and a collaboration space, but also access to the speaker. So that's why we've got your email in there. And if folks want to reach out to you, that seems like a good opportunity to create a relationship. Looks like we have a question here. Is health data being collected on those who are eating more ancestral foods?
Not that I know of, but I think that would be a great research project. And what I am trying to also do is where it's appropriate in these communities, make sure that our tribal colleges are included so that students have the opportunity to do on the ground research of not just the restoration for the tree planting, but also the benefits of bringing in food source species and looking at, I know that there's been research done on the nutrient content of, say, chokecherries and its ability for the seed to actually kill cancer cells. So I know that trying to keep up with some of the great research that's being done out there, through Dr. Carletta Chief and through Dr. Kyle Powell White, through Dr. Michelle Montgomery, Sierra Green, soon to be Dr. Green, and I could go on and on. There's a lot of really great, Dr. Dominique David Chavez, who are all these indigenous researchers who are looking into how to make sure that, one, that tribes data is continued, the data sovereignty is brought to the forefront, that their voices are at the table prior to implementation or planning begins, and to suggest to federal and state partners how to effectively engage with tribes in a way that you're not confusing them and making the process so incredibly difficult that it's overwhelming. And so one of the things we do is try to help tribes with that incredibly difficult grant process writing for federal agency. We just finished the BOR grant that was just tremendously difficult to get through. And so we also help tribes to get through some of those difficult processes of applying for funding. So I would say, for our foundations, to make sure that they try to increase, unrestricted funding for us to be able to try to help tribes on the ground who are working to get funding for on the ground work, and also to be able to be at these places to try to lift Indigenous voices, which is how we do it through our webinars. We do it when we work with our partners on the ground, is to say, these people need to be at this table before you even begin. So I hope that speaks to the question that was asked. Sorry.
Yeah, I think so. I think that information going back to federal agencies is particularly helpful right now, as the Biden administration's been showing a lot of signs that they're going to prioritize working with tribal nations. And
I'd like to say one last thing about policy, and that is that the land tenure policy needs to change. One of the reasons I did my PhD work was to give sort of some quantitative and qualitative data to demonstrate that our species such as cottonwood, which is really a keystone species used for ceremony, as well as chokecherry, buffalo berry, our traditional species, were becoming harder to find, to locate, to harvest, which is having an impact on our ability to express our cultural traditions. And so what I wanted to do was to get the Fed's attention to say land tenure policy, particularly on checkerboard ownership tribes, whether you have fee patent and you have tribal trust and individual trust lands, that the tribe should have the major say over all lands within reservation boundaries. If you're trying to get rid of Russian olive and your neighbor who is non-Indian plants it purposely to stabilize their floodplain irrigation ditches, it pretty much is a moot point.
Yeah, no, it's helpful. It's something I see a lot working with resource managers, that if there's not sovereignty over the lands, they can't really adapt to climate change.
And even in food sovereignty, if you want to try to, grow some orchards, or you want to try to restore, you have to go through NEPA. We have to go through a lot of hoops, tribes do as well, in order to restore lands. I think they make it extremely difficult. And it doesn't have to be. I think it needs, but it needs to change at the policy level. And now that we have Deb Holland, why I think it's so really important that we have her at the helm, is that perhaps land tenure policies can be changed for the better.
What package?
That one, I think.
Yeah,
I see
thanks
that
for that.
from the Did you?
Yeah, sounds like we got some feedback. Oh, I found it. Okay, good.
Anyone else have anything to add to any of the land tenure issues or funding problems that natural resource departments face with tribes. Any other questions relative to that?
There's a question here about food sovereignty.
Okay.
It doesn't speak directly to land tenure, but it asks, in your work with tribal leaders, do you offer guidance on the governance requirements of food sovereignty?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
In your work with tribal leaders, do you offer guidance on the governance
Absolutely.
requirements of food sovereignty?
Absolutely. I mean, that's part of what we do. We don't tell tribes what to do, you know, they've had enough of that in the past. So what we do is when I came in to indigenize this process means to listen to what are the issues and then try to implement what are, resolutions to trying to help the tribe implement these restoration projects, and particularly around food sovereignty. And so what we do is try to help you find the resources you need, whether that's, and that includes funding, whether that includes tribal capacity building, particularly GIS, mapping, so you can keep track of that, whether that's identifying a local grower to grow specific species, whether that's getting trained so that you can know how to go and collect local seed source and how and where to store that. That's another webinar series we're going to be offering in the future, is more on the ground kinds of demonstration types of projects for seed collection, seed storage, starts, and how to disseminate those in the community. So more a practical and from the Indigenous voice perspective, which is sort of the survey feedback we received from our webinar series. But yes, we certainly try to, provide you with any guidance that you might need. But I might say that it's really important that the community is engaged. And a lot of times that's a challenge for some communities, but you will always find someone who's a leader in the community doing something, like in ours, like a Peggy Well-Known Buffalo and, a Charlene Johnson and, Cedar Bulltail, those people who are actively trying to bring food sovereignty, traditional foods back into the community. And holding farmers markets is a great way in which you can start to bring in the community interest, and also including the youth component always. So, making sure that, you try to do these around cultural events is also kind of important, whether that's Clan Day or, what have you, is an important component to that. So we try to encourage those on the ground to work within the community, which is why we try to work through the nonprofits, local nonprofits, because they have the key to the community voice. And it's always going to be successful in a project if it comes from the bottom up within the community. It's driven as a grassroots effort rather than a top down. So
Great.
yeah, in a long drawn out answer, yes, we try to help and provide anything that you might need. But we never want to take over a project because it's not ours, it's yours.
Here's another question, just came in the chat. How could an environmental program partnering with a tribal diabetes program utilize TWP to create a project that brought in traditional seeds for a community garden or create a greenhouse?
Absolutely, that's excellent. Actually, what TWP would want to do is try to identify for you the funding that might help bring the community together. And what I would suggest, and what I had wanted to do as a postdoc project that didn't get funded, was essentially to identify species within the reservation boundaries for specific food sources and collect those seeds and do some grafting, or taking some of those branches so we can graft or grow those in a greenhouse, and have students come in and do those as projects, and then have those put together in a package with seeds, directions on how to plant them, and then hold a feed where we bring together everyone to learn how to really cook some of these traditional foods, pemmicans and, the wojapis, and, all of those kinds of traditional foods. And then that is an opportunity for the community to come together in the, so for traditional foods and celebration of culture, and also giving out those seedlings for them to plant that the students have helped raise in the greenhouse or grow in the greenhouse. So it brings in the elders, it brings in the cooking component, it also brings in health professionals who are working to lower type 2 diabetes within the reservation and to talk about the nutritional benefits of these foods.
So then TWP provides some funding, some
We provide the
facilitation
funding,
services,
try to facilitate
some
the
guidance.
training on how to do that, to collect seed source, do the mapping to find out, make sure you know where those seed sources come from. And also what I would do is put you in touch with Intertribal Ag Council with Dr. Jeremy Pinto, who kind of essentially wrote the book, and I have access to that PDF form and I can send it to you. It's on tribal greenhouse management and infrastructure. It's not for the faint of heart. It does take a lot of dedication. I do know that one of the things we've tried to help with currently and recently is, if you have a hoop house or a greenhouse that needs covering because it's been, ravaged by a storm, we do try to find the funding to cover that. So those are the kinds of things that we try to do. Is if you have a current infrastructure, we don't actually come in and build things, but we do try to identify resources, funding resources to help that happen.
Yeah, that's helpful and a really needed service, I think, being able to work in these different spaces that
Absolutely. Yeah, we try to bring in some of that stuff that's harder to find funding for, and then try to help guide those leaders, those knowledge holders, our elders, those that are leading the charge for improving community health outcomes through bringing, traditional food sources back, trying to help them find funding, to find the ideas in order to bring together the community, to go through a greenhouse infrastructure process if they already currently have one. If they're lacking some materials and supplies, try to provide funding to buy those kinds of things. So those are the kinds of ways in which we try to support food sovereignty.
Wonderful.
Hope that helps.
Yeah, I think so. I think that it's very descriptive. And I guess Mark has an add-on question. Have you done any work with composting?
No, I'm sorry, we haven't. That's something that's a little bit more related to horticulture and more on the ground things, but I, would encourage tribes to incorporate that into any community gardening projects that you might, because it's part of gardening and helps with food waste. It reduces the food waste that's going into landfills. I don't know about you, but landfills on reservations are not pretty places, and they're difficult to manage, particularly, in rural areas. So I think it's a great way in which to begin educating community, but always starting with youth and always connecting with them. Also, tribal college students, university students who want to do work in their own backyards would definitely be another way in which to engage the community through our student ambassadors. It's sort of our Solar Warrior Empowerment Training Program approach, is that we want youth to begin to understand that they are future leaders of tomorrow and they play an important part, and to reduce addiction rates and to reduce suicide rates on reservations. It's important to bring in that component that the National and Youth Leadership Project folks do, which is that pro-social emotional behavior component in our training program. And so I would advise you to take a look at their project, their program. They're all over in New Mexico and Arizona in schools throughout South Dakota as well. And so we really, embrace their way in which they try to build self-esteem for our kids.
Yeah, and we've mentioned this numerous times. I think it's a really good point about youth empowerment, youth involvement, youth engagement. And
Absolutely.
there's so many ways to do that, and there is increasingly funding to do that. So I think
Yeah.
the more that to resource managers, federal agencies, and others prioritize getting youth involved in climate adaptation work or resilience building work that is local, really is an important investment. And you talked about kind of the interdisciplinary component of that, workforce development, but also pro-social, emotional involvement,
Right.
and connecting elders to youth. I was just gonna point out that if folks haven't seen this year's BIA Tribal Resilience Grant, the last two categories fund internships and youth engagement, and they're pretty short applications, 2 pages. So I encourage folks to look at that, because I think those are really good ways that any program or anything that you're working on currently, you can get youth involved and bring them into that space, and or partner with tribal colleges. So it's a really good opportunity. I'm going to plug in the Tribal Resilience Grant, Tribal Resilience Program link here in the chat in case folks are, and I'm happy to chat with folks too offline if they want to kind of explore that space and think about ways they might want to involve youth in their programming.
It's all about connecting culture through with language, people, and the important places that are traditional and historically important to tribal storytelling. All of that is a holistic way in which to approach any restoration projects, and it's how tribes do it, through ceremony. And so that is what drove me to do my work, was through the sacred Sundance ceremony, as my husband is a sun dancer, and our family holds the yellowtail, the Shoshone crow, the Apsalika Shoshone or Crow Shoshone style Sundance each year. And so that is really what drove my work, but also to try to get the policyholders' attention that land tenure is an issue in any kind of development on tribal lands, and that in restoring degraded ecosystems, tribes have to have a place at the, not just at the table, but a voice. And particularly trying to help tribes in post-burn scar sites, because, for instance, the New Mexico one was the 2011 Los Conchas fire. And now we are working in the Cameron Peak area, but always focusing on building capacity, trying to build local economies around foods and around restoration, because what happens on the land affects the water, it affects us. So it's all connected. The health of our people depends on the health of the land.
It looks like we got time for just one more question for you, Dr. Small. We have about 2 minutes, and this one just came in. Can you talk a bit about how you involve storytelling, ceremony, cultural practices / arts into your work?
I can give you an example. When we delivered 10,000 Douglas fir to Santo Domingo 2 years ago. They had been waiting for trees since the Las Conchas fire in 2012, and never got them from the Forest Service. So we delivered their trees, and their greenhouse happens to sit right in front of the senior center. The senior center, the seniors all came out after the seedlings were all unloaded into the greenhouse. All of the elders that came out of the senior center went through and prayed for all of these seedlings prior to our planting. We also make sure that important foods that are prepared by the women in the Pueblo are also reimbursed and made sure that they are appreciated and honored for their contribution. So the language in Santo Domingo Kiowa is not written, and so we knew the importance of including elders and youth to make sure that those intergenerational stories and the language associated with place and in taking care and planting of these seedlings was critical, and that is something that our program supports and promotes in all of our projects. So I hope that explains how we include ceremony and, you know, whether that's smudging in the morning or smudging our trees or praying over them or making sure we honor the women who are preparing the food, and making sure that the people that are the knowledge holders, that are also the culturally, you know, cultural elders who guide, you know, the cultural aspects of tribes, that we have their blessing as well before we start.
Yeah, I think that absolutely answered the question. Thank you so much, Dr. Small, for your presentation, for your wisdom, for your kind words. And we had
thank
some.
you all so much for coming and listening to me. And I'm sorry about that YouTube thing. And please contact me if you have any questions. It's been an honor to be here. And thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about the role of nonprofits in helping tribes build resilient communities.
Absolutely. Glad to have you. And this recording will be on our YouTube channel later today. So if you want to watch it again or watch anything you missed or pass it along, feel free to do so. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your week. We'll see you soon.